Sarah Bennett picked up the engagement ring Charles Whitmore had left on her kitchen table, the ring every woman in Willow Creek said she should be grateful for, and she walked straight out the front door, crossed the yard in the cold morning dark, pushed open the barn door, and placed that ring in Ethan Walker's hand without saying a single word. Ethan stared at it. "Sarah, don't." Her voice didn't shake. "I'm done letting you decide what I deserve. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel, hit that bell and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Ethan Walker had been telling himself the same lie for so long that it had stopped feeling like a lie. It felt like the truth. It felt like the ground beneath his boots solid fixed, and not something a reasonable man questioned. The lie was simple. He was not the kind of man a woman like Sarah Bennett was meant to choose. He had rehearsed that belief through 7 winters on a struggling ranch outside Willow Creek, Montana. He had rehearsed it every time he fixed her fence without being asked. Every time he brought her firewood before a storm. Every time he sat across from her at her kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching her laugh and thinking, not me. Not for a woman like her. Not for a man like me. Ethan was 36 years old. He owned 140 acres of honest, hard-luck land that gave back exactly as much as a man put into it, which meant it gave back slowly and without much mercy. The fences needed work every season. The barn roof had been patched so many times the patches had their own patches. The cattle were healthy, but modest in number, and every winter reminded Ethan that survival was not guaranteed. It was earned one frozen morning at a time. The people of Willow Creek respected him. That much was true. If a neighbor's wagon broke a wheel on the road, they sent for Ethan. If a family's chimney caught fire before the first snow, Ethan was already climbing the roof before anyone finished asking. If a dispute needed settling between reasonable men who had let stubbornness get ahead of common sense, they brought Ethan in to talk it through, because Ethan Walker had a voice that made people feel like they'd been heard, even when he was telling them they were wrong. But respect and worthiness were 2 different things, and Ethan had spent the better part of a decade confusing one for the other. He figured the town respected him the way people respected a good workhorse. Reliable, present, necessary even, but not the kind of thing you brought inside and treated like something precious. That was his private shame, and he carried it quietly, the way a man carries something heavy in a coat pocket, always there, pressing against his ribs, but invisible to anyone who didn't already know to look. And then there was Sarah. Sarah Bennett had come to Willow Creek 9 years ago, arriving on the afternoon stage from Helena, with 2 trunks, a determined expression, and a recipe box her grandmother had pressed into her hands at the depot. She was 20 years old, then full-bodied and deliberate in her movements, with dark eyes that noticed everything, and a mouth that said exactly what she thought when she felt safe enough to say it. She had taken up the small farmhouse on the east edge of town, the one that sat back from the road behind a leaning stand of cottonwood trees, and she had made it hers within the first season. The garden she planted that first spring was the talk of Willow Creek, not because anyone was impressed by a woman growing her own food, but because what Sarah grew and the way she arranged it and the things she did with it were not what anyone expected from a young woman on her own. She grew herbs that the town doctor started coming to her for. She grew vegetables she preserved and quietly left on the porches of families who had gone lean after a bad season, never knocking, never needing to be thanked. She made medicines from what she pulled out of that garden that worked on fevers and chest colds and infections better than what came out of the general store's back shelf. And she taught anyone who asked her how she did it with a patience that never ran short. But Willow Creek was a small town, and small towns are rarely kind to women who do not fit neatly into the shape the town has decided women should be. Sarah was a plus-size woman. She was soft in places that the narrow-waisted women of Willow Creek were not, and she moved through the world in a body that some people in that town had decided without her permission and without any particular justification was something to be apologized for. The whispers followed her to church. The sidelong looks followed her to the market. The well-meaning comments, the ones that dressed cruelty up in the language of concern, followed her everywhere else. She had learned to absorb them without flinching. That was the armor she had built over years. Not hardness exactly, but a kind of stillness, a refusal to let anyone see the hit land. She smiled when it would have been easier to cry. She stayed pleasant when she had every right to be cold. She kept showing up in spaces where she was quietly unwelcome, and kept doing so with such consistent grace that eventually, even the most stubborn women in Willow Creek ran out of ways to pretend she wasn't remarkable. Ethan had noticed her the first week she arrived. Not because of any single dramatic moment. Not because she knocked him sideways in the street or said something that stopped his heart. It happened the way most true things happened, gradually, and then all at once. He had seen her in the market listening carefully to old Hattie Greer explain the way her knees ached before a storm. And Sarah had set down what she was carrying and given Hattie her full attention, asking questions that were so specific and so thoughtful that Hattie had grabbed Sarah's hands at the end and told her she was the first person in 2 years who had made her feel like her suffering was worth taking seriously. Ethan had been standing 6 feet away, pretending to examine a sack of flour. He had thought that woman sees people. And that had been the beginning of everything, including the particular kind of quiet anguish that had been his companion ever since. Because a man who believed he did not deserve to be chosen did not walk up to a woman like that and say anything at all. He waited. He stayed useful. He made himself necessary in the small, practical ways that he told himself were friendship, knowing all along they were something else entirely. 7 years of that. 7 years of early mornings and long evenings, and the kind of closeness that looked like friendship from the outside and felt on the inside like holding your breath underwater, manageable until it wasn't. He repaired her fence every spring when the frost heaved the posts. He brought her firewood before the first snow without being asked, stacking it under the lean-to beside her house where it would stay dry. After the bad summer when her well ran low, he spent 3 days digging it deeper with 2 other men he'd recruited, and when Sarah tried to thank him, he'd tipped his hat and told her any neighbor would have done the same, which they both knew wasn't true. She brought him food in return. That was how it worked between them. The silent economy of 2 people who cared for each other without ever naming what the caring was. She would appear at his barn door on a Tuesday afternoon with a pot of something that smelled like every good thing in the world, and she would stay while he ate, and they would talk for an hour or 2 about nothing consequential and everything that mattered. And then she would go home, and he would stand in his barn afterward, feeling more like himself than he'd felt all week. He knew she counted on him. He could see it the way her shoulders dropped when she heard him ride into the yard, the way she talked to him differently than she talked to anyone else, without the careful distance she kept between herself and the people who had hurt her. She trusted him. That was plain. But trust was not the same as choice. And Ethan had long since convinced himself that a woman like Sarah, smart and kind and capable of more than Willow Creek had ever given her credit for, would eventually find a man who could match her. A man with more land, more money, more standing. A man who hadn't spent the last decade barely keeping a modest ranch together through sheer stubborn refusal to admit defeat. He had even built a story around it, a noble story. The kind of story a man tells himself when the truth is too painful to look at directly. He called it stepping aside. He called it wanting what was best for her. He dressed his fear up in the language of generosity and convinced himself he was being selfless. What he was actually doing was running. Just running slowly enough that he could pretend it was standing still. Margaret Collins was Sarah's closest friend, a woman of 50 who had seen more of life than most people twice her age and who had exactly no patience for self-deception in any of its forms. She had watched Ethan and Sarah circle each other for the better part of 6 years, and she had held her tongue for most of it on the theory that people needed to arrive at their own truths in their own time. But Margaret's patience was not infinite. She appeared at Sarah's door one evening in late September with a jar of apple preserves and an expression that meant she had not come to talk about apples. "Sit down," Margaret said, setting the preserves on the table without ceremony. "We need to talk about Ethan Walker." Sarah poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. "Margaret." "No." Margaret held up one hand. "Let me finish before you talk me out of it. I've been watching you two dance around each other for going on 6 years, and I have run completely out of patience. We're friends. You are not friends, and you know you are not friends. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you've known for a long time that you are not friends. Margaret wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. What you are is two people who have each decided for their own foolish reasons that they don't deserve what is sitting right in front of them. Sarah was quiet for a moment. He's never said anything. He's never said anything because he thinks you deserve better than him. The words landed somewhere deep, and Sarah looked away toward the window. Outside, the evening was going dark over the cottonwoods. That's not his decision to make, she said quietly. No, Margaret agreed. It is not. And yet there he is making it every single day. Sarah turned her coffee cup slowly in both hands. You don't know that's why, Sarah. Margaret's voice was gentle, but it did not move. I have known Ethan Walker for 15 years. That man looks at you like you hung the moon and then talks himself out of it before you can turn around and see it. He is kind and he is hardworking and he is quietly one of the finest people I have ever known, and he is absolutely convinced that none of that is enough. She paused. And I think you might feel the same way about yourself. That landed harder. Sarah set her cup down. I just mean, Margaret said softer now, that you've both spent a long time letting other people's opinions of you become your own. And I'd hate to watch you let those opinions cost you something real. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that meant someone was thinking the truth into focus. I don't know how to start that conversation, Sarah said finally. Yes, you do, Margaret told her. You just haven't decided yet that you're allowed to. That conversation lodged in Sarah's chest and stayed there through the rest of September and into October while the town began buzzing with news about Charles Whitmore. Charles Whitmore arrived in Willow Creek on a Wednesday, which was not a day when extraordinary things typically happened in that town. But Charles Whitmore was the kind of man who had a talent for making ordinary circumstances feel like they were orbiting him rather than the other way around. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered and well-dressed, in the way that people were well-dressed when money was not something they had to think carefully about. He had ridden up from Billings, where he held interests in 2 banks and a cattle operation that ran to several thousand acres across 3 counties, and he had come to Willow Creek because his cattle needed a new water agreement with some of the smaller ranchers in the valley. But Willow Creek was small and news moved fast, and by Thursday morning what people were talking about was not the water agreement. What they were talking about was that Charles Whitmore had seen Sarah Bennett in front of the general store and had asked to be introduced. By Friday, the women at the church hall were discussing whether it would be too forward for Sarah to invite him to supper. By Saturday, the postmaster's wife had told 4 different people that she had it on good authority that Charles Whitmore had told his associate he found Sarah to be, quote, a very handsome and capable woman, which in the language of men who chose their words carefully was practically a declaration. The attention made Sarah uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite name. She had spent so many years absorbing the town's low expectations of her that having the town suddenly recalibrate, not because they'd changed their minds about her, but because a man with money and standing had indicated she was worth noticing, felt less like being seen and more like being pointed at. She mentioned it to Ethan on a Wednesday afternoon when he came by to look at the loose board on her porch steps. Town's making a lot of noise about this Whitmore man, she said, handing him the hammer he'd left leaning against the railing last visit. Ethan crouched down and tested the board with his thumb. Reckon they would. You met him. Briefly, down at the feed store. He worked the nail loose and set it aside, reaching for a new one from the tin on the step. Seems like a substantial man. There was something careful in the way he said it. Sarah noticed. Substantial, she repeated. Land money connections. Ethan drove the nail in with 3 clean strokes. Man like that could offer a woman a great deal. Sarah was quiet long enough that Ethan looked up. Is that what you think I need? She asked. A man with land and money and connections? He held her gaze for a half-second too long before he looked back at the step. I think you deserve someone who can take proper care of you. Ethan Walker. Her voice went very still. I have been taking proper care of myself for 9 years. He tested the board. Solid. He stood up and handed her back the hammer. You know what I mean. I don't, she said. I genuinely do not know what you mean. Because every time we get close to saying something true, you find a way to say something practical instead. He had no answer for that. He picked up his tin of nails and looked at her for a moment in the October afternoon light, and whatever he almost said, he did not say it. He tipped his hat. Step solid now, he told her. Should hold through winter. He walked back to his horse and rode out of the yard, and Sarah stood on the porch he had just repaired and felt something shift inside her, not into place, not yet, but into motion, like a wheel that had been still a long time finally beginning to turn. It was Margaret who told her about the conversation Ethan had with Bill Dawson at the hardware store. Bill was not a malicious man, but he was an enthusiastic one, and he had asked Ethan directly what he thought about Charles Whitmore's interest in Sarah Bennett. Bill had expected Ethan to say something non-committal. Ethan usually said something non-committal when the conversation came close to things that mattered. What Bill did not expect was for Ethan to say, Charles Whitmore is a good man and Sarah deserves a good man. Said it clear. Said it plain. The way Ethan said things when he had made up his mind. And then he paid for his nails and walked out. Margaret heard this from Bill's wife by Saturday morning, and she was on Sarah's porch by noon. He's going to step aside, Margaret said without preamble. He's already decided, and he's going to dress it up as wanting what's best for you, and he's going to let himself lose the best thing in his life, because he is the most genuinely good and genuinely foolish man I have ever had the misfortune to care about. Sarah had been braiding dried herbs at the kitchen table. She set them down. What am I supposed to do about that, Margaret? You are supposed to stop waiting for him to figure it out on his own. Margaret sat down across from her with the authority of a woman who had waited too long for too many things and was not interested in watching someone else make the same mistake. Sarah, how long are you going to let him talk himself out of something real? He has to make his own choice. He has made his choice. He has made it every morning for 7 years. He chooses you every single morning and then spends the rest of the day convincing himself he shouldn't. Margaret reached across and put her hand flat on the table between them. The question is whether you're going to let him. Sarah looked at her hands. I don't know if he does, Margaret said. You know he does. Charles Whitmore came to call that Thursday. He was gracious. He brought good wine and said the right things and was genuinely pleasant company. He told Sarah he admired the way she had built her life here, that it took a particular kind of strength to create something solid on your own in a small town. He said it with a sincerity that she did not doubt. He was a good man, she knew that. She also knew, sitting across from him at her own table drinking wine he had brought, that she felt nothing that felt like the truth. She felt the performance of a possibility. She felt the shape of what people thought she should want. She did not feel what she felt when Ethan Walker walked into a room. After Charles left that evening, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The ring he had left far too soon, far too presumptuous, the kind of gesture a man made when he was accustomed to being told, yes, sat on the table between her and the lamp. Gold and considerable, a statement about what kind of life he was offering. She looked at it for a long time, and she thought about Ethan standing at her porch telling her a step was solid. Thought about him driving nails with 3 clean strokes and handing her back her own hammer. Thought about 7 winters of firewood, 7 springs of fence posts. Thought about the way he listened to her without looking for the end of what she was saying, so he could start talking. She thought about what Margaret had said. How long are you going to let him talk himself out of something real? She picked up the ring. She walked out into the dark, and when she pushed open the barn door the next morning, cold and early, the sky just going pale in the east. Ethan was already there, moving between the horses with the quiet efficiency of a man whose mornings were always earlier than they needed to be. He turned when he heard the door. took in the look on her face. Whatever question he was about to ask, he didn't ask it. She crossed the barn floor, every step deliberate, every step carrying something she'd been carrying for years and was done carrying alone. She stopped in front of him and held out her hand. Charles Whitmore's ring lay in her palm. Ethan stared at it. "Sarah, I am not here to talk about him." Her voice was steady. "I am here because I am done letting you make decisions about my life that are yours to make." He started to say something. She shook her head. "You told Bill Dawson he was a good man and I deserved a good man." She closed her fingers around the ring and let her hand drop. "You were right. I do deserve a good man. I have deserved one for 9 years." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Sarah, stop." The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You have spent 7 years doing everything for me except the one thing I actually needed. Do you know what that was?" He didn't answer. "I needed you to believe you were worth wanting." The barn went very quiet. One of the horses shifted. The pale light came through the gaps in the old wood walls and lay in long, narrow strips across the floor between them. Ethan looked at her. "I've got 140 acres that spend most of the year fighting me," he said. "A barn roof that knows every rainstorm personally. I know what you've got." She stepped closer. "I also know what you give. And those are two different things, and you have spent your entire life pretending they're the same." His voice dropped. "You deserve more than a struggling ranch and a man who—" "Ethan Walker." She said his name the way she said things when she was absolutely certain. "Don't you dare finish that sentence." He stopped. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had always looked at him when he wasn't watching, like she was reading something true in him that he had never been able to read in himself. "You showed up," she said quietly, "every single time, for 7 years. You showed up when nobody asked you to, and you never made me feel like it cost you anything, even when I knew it did. You listened to me when I was scared, and you fixed things when they were broken, and you never once made me feel like my body, or my life, or my choices were something to be apologized for." Her voice was steady, and it was real, and it did not waver. "Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand what that's worth?" He didn't answer. She put the ring on the windowsill beside a rusted lantern that had hung there since before either of them could remember. "I'm not asking you to be Charles Whitmore," she said. "I'm asking you to stop deciding I need him." The silence stretched. Then, "I don't know how to do this, Sarah." "Yes, you do." She almost smiled. "You've been doing it for 7 years. The only thing you've never done is let yourself believe it counted." He exhaled slowly, looked at the floor, looked back at her. "I'm not a man who has things to offer. You're the only man who has ever made me feel like the things I have to offer matter." She tilted her head slightly. "That seems like it ought to count for something." Something moved in his face, something that had been locked down for a long time. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Just tell me plain. I want you to stop standing on the other side of a wall you built yourself." She held his gaze. "That's all I'm asking. Just stop." The morning light was fully up now, coming through the barn walls in those long, pale strips laying across both of them, where they stood facing each other, in the space between horses and old wood, and 7 years of everything that had never been said. Ethan Walker had been telling himself a lie for so long, it had come to feel like the truth. But standing in that barn with Sarah Bennett, looking at him like he was not a man who lacked enough, but a man who had simply been standing in the wrong place, the lie finally ran out of room to breathe. He reached out, slowly, the way a man reached for something he was afraid to want, because he was afraid to lose it. His hand found hers. She didn't pull away. "I don't know where to start," he said. "You already started," she told him. "You started the day you stacked firewood under my lean-to because you wanted to, not because anyone asked you to." Her fingers wrapped around his. "We just got turned around for a while. That's all." He looked down at their hands. Something settled in him. Something that had been braced against a blow for 7 years finally stopped bracing. Outside the barn, Willow Creek was waking up the way it always did, slow and unremarkable in the October morning. The cattle were moving in the near pasture. A wagon was coming up the main road from the direction of town. Somewhere, a dog was making noise about something that probably didn't require that much noise. The world was the same as it had always been. But in the barn, something had changed. Sarah Bennett had crossed the floor, and Ethan Walker had finally, for the first time in 7 years, allowed himself to be standing where she was walking toward. Ethan did not let go of her hand right away. He held it the way a man held something he had convinced himself for years he had no right to touch carefully, almost uncertainly, as if releasing it too fast might prove he had imagined the whole thing. Sarah did not rush him. She understood in the way she had always understood him, without needing him to explain himself, that what was happening inside Ethan Walker right now was not a small thing. 7 years of a fixed belief did not dissolve in a single morning. It cracked. It shifted. But it did not simply disappear. "You're not going to wake up tomorrow and regret this," he said. "Ethan? I'm serious." "So am I." She squeezed his hand once, and then let him have it back. "I didn't walk across that barn floor on accident. I've been thinking about walking across that barn floor for 2 years. He looked at her. 2 years. At least. He exhaled slowly through his nose, and looked at the ceiling of the barn, the way men looked at ceilings when they were trying to recalibrate their entire understanding of the last several years of their lives. "You might have said something. You might have made it possible to say something," she told him. "But every time I got close, you found a practical thing to talk about. The step needed fixing." "The step always needs fixing, Ethan. That is not the point." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that Sarah had catalogued years ago and knew meant he was fighting it. She had a whole private dictionary of Ethan Walker's almost expressions. She had never told him that. She was beginning to think she should. He picked up the ring from the windowsill, turned it over once in his hand. "You're really not going to give this back to him? I left it on his associate's doorstep this morning on my way here," she said, "with a note." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A polite note," she added. He set the ring back down. "He's not going to take that well." "No," she agreed. "He is not." And she was right about that. Charles Whitmore did not take it well. By noon, the same day, word had reached the far end of Willow Creek that Sarah Bennett had declined Charles Whitmore's proposal, or whatever the gesture of leaving an expensive ring on a man's doorstep was called, when there had not technically been a proposal, yet only a strong implication of one. The town processed this information the way small towns processed anything that disrupted the story they had already decided to tell. Loudly. And with opinions. The general store became, by 2 o'clock that afternoon, an informal courtroom where Whitmore's case was being tried in absentia. Agnes Porter, who ran the millinery shop next door and considered herself the authoritative voice on matters of local decorum, held the view that Sarah Bennett had lost her mind. A man like Charles Whitmore, Agnes said, did not come along twice in a woman's lifetime, and a woman in Sarah's position here. Agnes did not specify exactly what position she meant, but her tone said everything. She did not ought to have better sense than to throw away the one serious offer she was ever likely to receive. Dottie Hale, who had known Sarah since her first week in Willow Creek and had watched the town treat her poorly for the better part of 9 years, said Agnes Porter, could keep her opinion in her own hat shop where it belonged. This exchange was reportedly quite dramatic. By 3 o'clock, 4 different versions of it were circulating. What nobody in town knew yet, because Ethan and Sarah had not told anyone anything, was the reason. Ethan found out about the general store conversation when he rode into town that afternoon to pick up a delivery of fencing wire he'd been waiting on since September. Bill Dawson met him at the hardware store door with the particular expression of a man who had news and was barely containing it. "You hear about Sarah," Bill said. "What about her?" "Turned down Whitmore." Bill lowered his voice as if there were people within earshot, which there were not. Left his ring on his man's doorstep this morning. Ethan kept his face even. That right. Agnes Porter is half out of her mind about it. Says Sarah's thrown away her best chance. Bill studied Ethan's expression with the focused attention of a man who had been watching two people not quite say things to each other for 6 years. You know anything about this? Not my business to know anything about it. Ethan? I've got fencing wire to pick up Bill. He got his fencing wire. He loaded it into the wagon with the efficient movements of a man doing something familiar while thinking about something else entirely, and he was almost done when Charles Whitmore walked out of the hotel across the street. Whitmore saw him, paused, then crossed. He was a well-made man, Ethan would give him that. Broad through the shoulders, steady in his walk, the kind of physical composure that came from having moved through the world without much resistance for a long time. He stopped at the tailgate of Ethan's wagon and looked at the fencing wire for a moment before he looked at Ethan. Walker, he said. Whitmore. You hear what happened this morning? Word travels fast in a small town. Ethan said carefully. It does. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked like a man who was deciding how direct to be and then deciding to be direct. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight. All right. Is there something between you and Miss Bennett? Ethan held the man's gaze. He thought about 7 years. He thought about a hand held in a barn and a ring on a windowsill. He thought about the particular cowardice of giving an answer that was technically accurate while being fundamentally dishonest. Yes, he said. Whitmore absorbed this without any visible change of expression. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he nodded once slowly, like a man confirming something he had suspected. I see. He looked at the wagon again. She's a remarkable woman. She is. You treated her well. The question surprised Ethan, not its content, its honesty. It was not the question of a man who was angry or threatened. It was the question of a man who had genuinely cared about the answer. I aim to, Ethan said. Whitmore nodded again. He turned and walked back toward the hotel without another word. No raised voice, no threat, nothing. Ethan watched him go. He felt something he had not expected to feel, which was a complicated mix of respect and relief and the particular vertigo of a man who had just claimed out loud for the first time something he had spent years refusing to claim. He drove home slower than he needed to. It was Margaret Collins who told Sarah about the exchange in the street because Margaret had been coming out of the dry goods store across the way at precisely the right moment and had watched the whole thing from 40 feet away, reading the posture and body language of both men with the focused attention she brought to everything she considered important. She appeared at Sarah's door before supper. He told him, Margaret said. Sarah looked up from the pot she was stirring. What? Ethan. Whitmore walked up to him in the street and asked him point blank if there was something between you two, and Ethan said yes. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, with the satisfied expression of a woman whose patience had finally, after considerable time, been rewarded. Just like that. Yes. One word. No hedging. Sarah set the spoon down. He said yes. Clear as anything. She sat down across from Margaret. Something moved through her that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was somewhere in the territory of both the particular feeling of watching a thing you had been afraid to hope for take a shape you could actually see. Did Whitmore? He was gracious about it, Margaret said, which I will admit surprised me, but then I think Charles Whitmore is probably a better man than this town gave him credit for. He just wasn't the right one. She folded her hands on the table. The right one told a man twice his financial standing yes without blinking. Sarah looked at her hands. I'm scared, Margaret. I know, not of him, of what comes after. She looked up. Of all the ways this could go wrong. He's spent 7 years being certain he wasn't enough. You don't just stop being certain of something like that because one morning changes. Margaret looked at her steadily. No, she agreed. You don't. But you stop being alone in it, and that's not nothing. Sarah was quiet. He's going to need time, she said. He is. And you're going to need patience. I have patience. You have grace. Margaret corrected. That's different. Grace is what you show other people. Patience is what you practice on yourself when things don't move as fast as you want them to. She tilted her head. Both of you are going to need both. 3 days later, Ethan came to supper. Not to fix something. Not because there was a practical reason. He rode up to her farmhouse in the early evening, tied his horse at the post, and knocked on her door, which he had never done before, because for 7 years he had always come with a purpose that justified his presence, and he had never before shown up simply because he wanted to be there. Sarah opened the door and looked at him. He had his hat in his hand. He had combed his hair, which she noted and stored away carefully. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she also noted. I thought maybe, he said, if you hadn't eaten yet. I made too much stew, she said. Come in. He came in. They ate at the kitchen table, the way they had eaten 100 times before. The same table, the same 2 chairs, the same lamp between them, but everything was different in the way that things were different when the truth had been named. The same gestures carried different weight. When he refilled her water glass without being asked, it meant something it had not meant before, or rather, it meant out loud, what it had always meant privately. After supper, he helped her wash up, which was also new, and they stood at the basin together in a comfortable silence that was not quite the same as the comfortable silence they had always shared. This one had more room in it. More possibility. Whitmore's leaving Friday, he said. I heard. He didn't make any trouble. I know. I'm not surprised. She handed him a bowl to dry. He's a decent man. He just wasn't... She paused. Wasn't what? She looked at him. He wasn't you. Ethan held the bowl for a moment, set it down, looked at the basin. Sarah, I need to tell you something. All right. He stopped, started again. I've been telling myself a story for a long time, about why I wasn't the right choice for you. And I told myself it was because I was being honorable, thinking of you. He was looking at the basin still, but the truth is, I was scared. And I let that fear wear the costume of generosity because that was easier to live with. The kitchen was very quiet. I know, she said. He looked at her. You knew. I've known for years what you were doing and why. She kept her voice even. I was scared too, just of different things. What were you scared of? She was quiet for a moment. That if I said something and you said no, I'd lose what we already had. And what we already had was... She looked down at the basin. It was the best thing in my life, Ethan. Even when it wasn't enough. He put the dish towel down on the counter and turned to face her fully. It should have been more, he said. A long time ago. I'm sorry it wasn't. Don't apologize for the years, she told him. Just don't waste the ones that are left. He reached out and tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear the first time he had ever touched her face, and she went very still, the way a person went still when something they had wanted for a long time finally arrived. I won't, he said quietly. And that was the beginning of something that the town of Willow Creek watched unfold over the following weeks with the varied reactions of a community that had not entirely decided yet how to process what it was seeing. Some people were glad. Bill Dawson and his wife had been pulling for Ethan and Sarah since approximately the 3rd year, which they confided to each other over supper and had never mentioned to anyone else. The Greer family, who had 7 children and had received anonymous deliveries of preserved food from Sarah's garden every lean winter for the last 6 years, thought it was the most natural thing in the world. Doc Hadley, who had come to rely on Sarah's medicines for half the ailments in the valley, said he'd be sending Ethan a thank you note if the man ever got his head out of the dirt long enough to deserve her. Others were less generous. Agnes Porter was not generous at all. Agnes had a theory about Sarah Bennett that she had been refining for 9 years, and that theory rested on the foundation that a woman like Sarah meaning a woman with Sarah's body. Sarah's social position. Sarah's particular combination of talent and defiance should be quietly grateful for whatever life provided, and should certainly not be rejecting wealthy men and taking up with struggling ranchers, as if she had some kind of standing to make choices based on what she actually wanted. Agnes shared this theory with anyone who would hold still long enough to hear it. She shared it on Tuesday at the millinery shop. She shared it on Wednesday at the church hall women's meeting. On Thursday, she shared it directly at Sarah. She came into the garden while Sarah was harvesting. The last of the season's herbs stood at the fence with the expression of a woman performing a charitable service and said, "Sarah, I want to speak frankly with you because I believe someone ought to." Sarah straightened up slowly and looked at her over the fence. "I've been hearing a great deal about you and Ethan Walker," Agnes said, "and I'll tell you plain. What I'll tell you. As a woman who has some experience of life, you made a serious mistake with Mr. Whitmore, and if you allow yourself to get caught up with Ethan Walker, you are going to spend the rest of your years on a ranch that barely keeps itself together, worrying about money and wondering what your life could have been." Sarah held the bundle of herbs she'd just cut, looked at Agnes Porter steadily. "Agnes," she said, "what made you happy when you were my age?" Agnes blinked. "I beg your pardon. When you were my age, what made you happy? Not what was practical, not what other people told you was sensible. What made you glad to be alive when you woke up in the morning?" Agnes opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm asking." Sarah said, "Because I notice that the advice you give is always about what I should give up and never about what I might gain. And I wonder sometimes if that's more about you than it is about me." Agnes Porter said nothing for a long moment. Then she gathered herself with visible effort, lifted her chin, and walked away from the fence with the posture of a woman whose dignity had been inconvenienced. Sarah watched her go. Then she went back to her herbs. It was Margaret again who appeared at her door that evening. "Agnes Porter is telling people you were rude to her." I asked her a question. Margaret sat down. "What question?" Sarah told her. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "Lord Sarah." What did she say? Nothing. Margaret considered this. Nothing is probably the most honest thing Agnes has said in 20 years. She folded her hands. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Sarah sat down across from her. "I'm tired of people telling me what I should want. I've been tired of it for 9 years. I just usually have better manners about saying so." "What changed?" Sarah thought about it. "I think when you stop negotiating your own worth, you stop having patience for people who tell you to negotiate it." She picked up her coffee cup. "I've spent a long time making myself smaller so other people would be comfortable. I'm not doing that anymore." Margaret looked at her with something close to pride. "Ethan Walker has no idea what's walking toward him." "He has some idea," Sarah said. "He's been watching for 7 years." "Watching and knowing are different things," Margaret said. "He's going to have to do some catching up." He was, and he knew it. That was the thing about Ethan Walker that Sarah had always understood and that the rest of the town had mostly missed. He was not a stupid man or an unaware one. He knew his own limitations with the same clear-eyed honesty he brought to everything else. What he had struggled with was not understanding his failures, but believing that his failures did not cancel out everything else. He came to her door again that Friday evening. He had this time brought something, a jar of honey from his own bees, the last of the season, which Sarah accepted without comment, because she understood the language he was working in small offerings. Steady presence, the grammar of a man who was learning to show up as himself rather than as a function. "I want to ask you something," he said, sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee. "Ask. You said you were scared too." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "You said different things. What did you mean by that? Not just losing what we had. What else?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That you'd see me. Really see me. And then realize you'd built something in your head that was easier to love than the real thing." He frowned. "What do you mean? You loved me from a distance for 7 years, Ethan. That's a different thing from loving someone close up. From close up, people are not who you imagined them to be. They're worse in some ways, and better in others, and mostly just more complicated. She held his gaze. I was scared you'd get close and discover that the Sarah you'd been carrying around in your head was better than the one sitting across from you at supper. He was quiet for a long moment. The Sarah sitting across from me at supper, he said finally. Asked Agnes Porter a question that I would have given 5 years off my life to watch in person. She laughed a real laugh, the kind that came out before you could stop it. Ethan had not heard her laugh like that in a long time, and the sound of it did something to him that he could feel in his chest. Bill's wife told you. Bill's wife tells me everything. He smiled. The real one, not the almost. Sarah, you want to know what I see from close up? She waited. I see a woman who has been told for 9 years that she is too much or not enough depending on the day, and who's talking, and who has somehow come through all of that without becoming bitter or small. I see a woman who leaves food on porches without knocking, and teaches people her medicines without keeping secrets, and repairs her own life with the same hands she uses to repair everyone else's. He looked at her steadily. That's not a picture I built in my head. That's what's in front of me right now. Sarah did not look away. You'd better mean that. I do. Because it gets harder before it gets easier, she said. This town is not going to be simple about us. Agnes Porter is just the beginning. I know. And I'm not going to hide this, or soften it, or make myself easier to digest, so people are comfortable. Her voice was even and certain. I have done that for 9 years, and I am done. Good, Ethan said. She blinked. Good. I don't want you to hide anything. He set the coffee mug down. I am tired of things being hidden. I hid what I felt for 7 years, and it made me feel like a man walking around with a borrowed life. I'm done with hiding things. He met her eyes. You be exactly who you are. I will handle the rest. She looked at him for a long time. Ethan Walker, she said slowly. If you keep talking like that, I'm going to start thinking you've been practicing. I've had 7 years to think about what I should have been saying, he told her. I've got a backlog. She laughed again, and that laugh was the sound of something settling not into place, but into the particular ease of two people who had been walking toward each other for a long time, and had finally closed the distance between them enough to walk side by side instead. What neither of them knew yet was that Charles Whitmore had not entirely left the picture. He had left Willow Creek on Friday as planned, but he had left behind 2 things. The first was a water rights agreement with 3 of the Valley ranchers that was by most accounts fair and reasonable. The second was a conversation he'd had with a man named Gideon Pruitt, who operated as Whitmore's man of business and who had a particular talent for noticing what people wanted and finding ways to make wanting it expensive. Pruitt was a lean, watchful man of indeterminate age who had been in Willow Creek for 3 weeks handling the logistical end of Whitmore's dealings, and who had formed during those 3 weeks a set of observations about the valley that went considerably beyond water rights. He had noticed specifically that Ethan Walker's land sat at the head of the valley in a position that controlled access to the best grazing corridor in the region. He had noticed that Ethan's fence lines, while maintained, were not always precisely documented. He had noticed that 3 of the smaller ranchers in the valley were behind on their agreements with the county land office. Pruitt was a man who collected these observations the way other men collected coins patiently with an eye toward eventual value. On the Friday evening that Ethan Walker sat in Sarah Bennett's kitchen and told her he had a backlog of things he should have said, Gideon Pruitt was sitting in the hotel dining room composing a letter to Charles Whitmore's attorneys. He was not composing it out of spite exactly. Pruitt was not a man who dealt in emotions that messy. He was composing it because it was his job to identify opportunity, and he had identified one, and the fact that the opportunity involved land belonging to a man who had just through the natural workings of affection and honesty inconvenienced. His employer was a coincidence that Pruitt did not find it necessary to examine too closely. The letter went out Saturday morning. By the following Wednesday, something was coming back. Ethan didn't know it yet. He was at Sarah's farm on Wednesday afternoon, helping her close up the garden for winter, the kind of work that filled a whole afternoon and required 2 pairs of hands and generated the kind of steady, companionable conversation that had always been the most comfortable thing between them, now carrying that additional weight of new honesty that made even the ordinary feel different. They were talking about nothing important, about whether the winter would come early, about a fence repair he had planned for the north pasture, about the preserving jars she needed from the general store, when her nearest neighbor's boy came running across the field at a pace that was not a casual pace. His name was Tommy Alcott, and he was 11 years old, and he had the expression of a boy who had been given important information and had been running with it since the moment he received it. "Mr. Walker," he called out while still 20 yards away. Ethan straightened up. "Tommy, Sheriff Hale's been looking for you." The boy pulled up at the fence, breathing hard. "He came by your place and you weren't there, and he said if anyone knew where you were to send word." He gulped air. "Said it's about your land." Ethan's expression did not change visibly, but something behind his eyes went very still. "What about my land?" "Didn't say, just said come in." Tommy looked between Ethan and Sarah with the frank curiosity of an 11-year-old who had absolutely noticed the changed atmosphere between them. "Said come soon as you could." Ethan looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. "Go," she said. "I'll be back." "I know." She held his gaze for a moment. "Whatever it is, Ethan. Whatever it is." He nodded, took his hat from the fence post where he'd set it, put it on with the particular deliberateness of a man who was arranging himself for something he didn't yet know the shape of, and rode toward town. Sheriff Hale's office was a square room at the end of Main Street that had the permanent smell of old coffee and documentation, and the sheriff himself was a careful man of 52 who had held his position for 16 years because he was neither easily rattled nor easily pushed. He had a letter on the desk when Ethan came in, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who was not looking forward to the conversation he was about to have. "Sit down, Ethan." "I'll stand." Ethan took off his hat. "What's this about?" Hale looked at the letter. "You familiar with a man named Gideon Pruitt, Whitmore's businessman?" "That's right." Hale picked up the letter. "Pruitt has filed a claim through the Whitmore organization's attorneys contesting the boundary line on your north pasture. They're saying your fence line encroaches on land they hold mineral rights to under a survey from 1871. The room was very quiet. Ethan stood with his hat in his hands. "That survey is 40 years old." "I know it. My grandfather filed that land in 1873. The boundary was established then. I know that too." Hale set the letter down. "But Pruitt has got a competing document, and he's filed it with the county land office, and now there's a process." He looked at Ethan with the steady honesty of a man who had known him for 20 years. "It may not go anywhere, but until it's settled, you can't sell, can't mortgage against that section, and the county office is going to want to review your original documentation." "Which I have." "Good. Then you need to get it together." Hale leaned forward. "Ethan, this is the kind of thing that takes time and money to fight, and it has a habit of not being about what it's about." Ethan looked at him. "Say that plain, Jim?" Hale was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt filed this claim 48 hours after Whitmore left town. I don't believe that's a coincidence, and I don't think you do either." The air between them was very still. "No," Ethan said. "I don't." He was not a man who showed what was happening inside him on his face. People who did not know him well sometimes thought that meant nothing was happening. People who knew him well understood that the stillness was not absence of feeling. It was something more like the stillness of deep water. Everything moving below the surface, contained by the effort of a man who had learned early that composure was a form of protection. He put his hat back on. "I'll get the documentation," he said. "Do that, and Ethan," Hale stopped him at the door. "Don't go looking for Pruitt." "I wasn't planning to." "I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway." Ethan nodded, walked out. He rode back toward Sarah's. Not because he had decided to go back there, more because his horse knew the way, and he was not paying attention to the direction with the portion of his mind that was usually in charge of navigation. He was paying attention instead to a feeling that he recognized, but did not welcome the particular cold certainty of a man who understood he was being targeted, not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because of something he had done right. He had claimed Sarah, and someone had decided that claiming Sarah was something that could be made expensive. He pulled up in her yard before he had finished deciding to. She came out of the house when she heard the horse. She read his face with the efficiency of someone who had been reading his face for 9 years, and said without asking any preliminary questions, "How bad?" "Could be nothing," he said. "Could be a problem." "Tell me," he told her. All of it straight through while she stood in her yard with her arms folded against the October chill and listened without interrupting the way she always listened, like the whole shape of the thing mattered, and she was not going to let her own reaction get in the way of understanding it fully. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is because of me." "Sarah, Ethan, don't." Her voice was flat and certain. "He left the same week you told Whitmore yes. That is not a coincidence, and we both know it. I told Jim Hale the same thing. What did Jim say? He said it had a habit of not being about what it's about." She nodded slowly. "He's right." She looked at him with an expression that was not guilt exactly, but something adjacent, the look of a person reckoning with the consequence of their own decision and refusing to flinch from it. "I'm sorry. I didn't think—" "Stop." His voice was quiet and firm. "Don't apologize for this. You didn't do this. Pruitt did this. Whitmore may have done this. You made a choice about your own life, and someone decided to make it costly. Those are two different things." She looked at him. "I need you to hear me," he said, "because I know what you're doing right now, and I need you to stop. You're already building a story in your head about how this is your fault, and how if you'd just been more careful or made a different choice, none of this would be happening. I know how that story goes, because I have been telling myself a version of it for 7 years. He met her eyes. "It goes nowhere good. Stop." She was quiet. "Ethan?" "Yeah. I am going to help you fight this." He started to say something. She kept going. "I have documentation," she said, "from 9 years of dealing with this town in every form it comes in. I have letters, agreements, the names of people who owe me favors in ways they would prefer not to make public, and a very clear memory for the details of things that other people assume women don't track." She held his gaze. "I am not someone who sits down when someone tries to move the fences, and I am not going to start now." He looked at her. Then he said, "You have names of people who owe you favors they'd prefer not to make public. I told you I've been here 9 years. He exhaled. "All right. All right. All right," he said. "We fight it." She nodded. Then after a moment, "Together." The word was not large, but it landed in him like something solid and real, the kind of word that changed the shape of what came after it. "Together," he agreed. And Willow Creek, which had spent years watching Ethan Walker and Sarah Bennett orbit each other from a careful distance, was about to discover that the two of them moving in the same direction was a considerably different matter than either of them moving alone. Neither of them knew yet how different. But they were about to find out. The documentation was in a tin box under the floorboard in the back bedroom of Ethan's ranch house, which was exactly where his grandfather had put it in 1873, and where his father had told him it was on the morning Ethan turned 18, the way other fathers passed down watches or rifles. It was not a romantic inheritance. It was a practical one, the kind of thing a man left his son when he understood that the world was full of people who would try to take what you had built if you could not prove you had built it. Ethan pulled it out that same evening after he left Sarah's yard, set it on the kitchen table, and went through every piece of paper in it with the methodical attention of a man who had learned early that details were not small things. They were the things that kept other things from being taken. The original survey was there, filed October 14, 1873, signed by the county surveyor and 2 witnesses, one of whom was the first sheriff of Willow Creek, a man named Foster, whose grandson currently ran the livery stable on the north end of Main Street. The boundary lines were clear. The north pasture was described in language so precise that Ethan, reading it by lamplight at his kitchen table, felt something loosen in his chest. The language did not lie. The land was his. But he also knew from 20 years of watching how things worked in this valley that being right and being protected were not always the same thing. A man could be entirely right and still spend 2 years and every dollar he had proving it, and at the end of 2 years, the land was still his, but the man was hollowed out. Pruitt knew that. That was the point. He was at Sarah's door by 7 the next morning. She had been up since 5. She had coffee ready and a stack of papers on the kitchen table that had not been there the evening before, and she had the expression of a woman who had spent the hours between midnight and dawn doing something useful with her sleeplessness. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." He sat. She put a letter in front of him. "Hattie Greer's grandson is a clerk at the county land office in Helena," she said. "I wrote to Hattie last night and asked her to ask him to pull the original mineral rights filing from 1871 that Pruitt is claiming." Ethan looked at the letter. "You wrote to her last night." "I wrote 4 letters last night." She sat across from him. The second one was to Doc Hadley's brother-in-law, who is an attorney in Bozeman. The third was to the editor of the Helena Gazette, who has purchased my preserves and my medicines for 3 years, and who once told me he owed me a conversation whenever I needed one. The fourth was to Margaret's cousin, who sits on the County Land Commission. Ethan was quiet. "Sarah, I told you I had names. You wrote 4 letters in the middle of the night." "I couldn't sleep." She folded her hands on the table. "When I can't sleep, I do something. That's always been my way." She looked at him steadily. "You spent 7 years not asking for help. I am not going to let you spend this fight the same way." He looked at the letter, at the 3 others stacked beside it, sealed and addressed. "You don't have to, Ethan?" Her voice was patient, but it was final. "I am choosing this, the same way I chose to cross that barn floor. Stop trying to carry things alone out of courtesy to me. It is not courtesy. It is a habit you need to break." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right. Good." She stood and refilled his coffee. "Now show me the documentation you brought." He spread it on the table, and she went through it with the careful attention she gave everything. Reading slowly, asking questions that were specific and sharp, tracing the boundary descriptions with her finger, and comparing them to a rough map she had sketched from memory of the valley's geography. She had been in Willow Creek for 9 years, and she had paid attention to all of it, not because she'd expected to need any particular piece of knowledge, but because paying attention was simply how she moved through the world. "This line here," she said, putting her finger on a number in the survey. "What does that reference? The creek marker. There's a stone cairn my grandfather built at the fork. Is it still there?" "Far as I know, I check the fence line every spring." "We need to check it now." She looked up. "Before Pruitt sends anyone out to look." He stared at her. "You think he'd—" "I think a man who files a 40-year-old competing document 2 days after his employer gets turned down by a woman is a man who plays aggressively." She held his gaze. "We need to be ahead of him." They rode out to the north pasture that morning. It was cold, the kind of October cold that had made up its mind and was not going to be argued with, and the ground was hard under the horses' feet. Sarah rode beside him without complaint, which was not something that surprised Ethan, but which he found himself noticing with a particular kind of attention, the way you notice things about a person when you had newly permitted yourself to see them fully. The cairn was there, solid, undisturbed, exactly where his grandfather had put it in 1873, a stack of flat stones at the creek fork that matched the survey description precisely. Sarah dismounted and examined it without being asked, running her hands over the stones, checking that the configuration matched what Ethan's documentation described. "It's intact," she said. "I know." She looked up at him. "You came out here recently, 2 days ago, after I talked to Jim Hale." He looked at the cairn. "I wanted to know what I was dealing with." You didn't tell me that. I'm telling you now. She stood up and faced him. No more of that. If you go somewhere to check something, you tell me. We are doing this together, and together means all of it, not the parts you decide I should know about. He took that. Fair. Thank you. She looked back at the cairn. Photograph this, today, before anything changes. I don't have a... Doc Hadley has a camera. He photographs injuries for his medical records. Ask him. She walked back to her horse. Today, Ethan. He got the photograph that afternoon. Doc Hadley came out personally, which Ethan had not expected, and stood at the cairn in his coat and said, Agnes Porter told my wife last week that you two getting together was the most foolish thing to happen in this county in a decade. He set up his camera with precise movements. I told my wife Agnes Porter wouldn't recognize sense if it sat down beside her in church. He looked through the lens. Hold still. The photograph was developed by evening. Ethan had 3 copies made. That was Thursday. By Friday, 2 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was that Hattie Greer's grandson in Helena pulled the 1871 mineral rights document that Pruitt's attorneys were claiming. He sent word back through his grandmother with a detail that nobody had mentioned until now. The document had been amended. Not in 1871, not in 1873, when Ethan's grandfather filed his survey. The amendment was dated 1887, 16 years later, and the handwriting on the amendment did not match the handwriting on the original document. Sarah read the letter standing in her kitchen at 6 in the morning, and her hands went very still. She sent Tommy Alcott running for Ethan before she had finished her coffee. He arrived in 20 minutes, which meant he had ridden fast, and she handed him the letter without preamble and watched his face while he read it. Someone altered the document, he said. That's what it looks like. Pruitt. Or someone before Pruitt. Or Pruitt found it already altered and used it. She sat down. It doesn't matter who altered it. What matters is that it was altered and we can prove it. Ethan set the letter down. He was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was thinking through something serious, not absent but interior, working through the shape of it before he said anything out loud. If we go to the county office with this, he said slowly, and Pruitt finds out we have it before we're ready. He'll move faster, Sarah said. I know. So we need to be ready before we move. Yes. How long do we have? She thought. The county land office has a 30-day review period on the challenge. We're 12 days in. She looked at him. 18 days. 18 days was not a long time. But it was enough if they moved correctly, and they both understood without needing to say it that moving correctly meant moving quietly. The second thing that happened on Friday was the thing that made quiet considerably harder. Agnes Porter told the wrong person the right story. Agnes had been building her narrative about Ethan and Sarah for 2 weeks, refining it the way a craftsman refined something. She was proud of adding details and context with each telling. The version she had arrived at by Friday was this. Sarah Bennett had rejected a wealthy, respectable man out of some kind of misguided pride, had taken up with a struggling rancher, whose land was now under legal dispute, and had in the process made herself not only foolish, but potentially a burden on a man who had enough trouble keeping his own affairs together. She told this version on Friday afternoon to a woman named Vera Stanton, whose husband Frank ran the largest competing ranch in the valley, and who had over the past several years been quietly interested in acquiring access to the grazing corridor that ran through Ethan's north pasture. Vera Stanton listened to Agnes with the focused attention of a woman cataloging useful information. She told Frank about it at supper. Frank Stanton appeared at Sheriff Hale's office the following Monday morning and asked in the pleasant manner of a man making a reasonable inquiry about the status of the land dispute on the Walker property. Hale told him politely that it was an open matter and not public information. Frank nodded pleasantly and left. Hale sent for Ethan within the hour. Ethan arrived to find Hale standing at his window with the expression of a man who had just watched something he did not like happen from a distance too great to intervene. Frank Stanton was here, Hale said. Ethan closed the door behind him. What did he want? Asked about your land dispute. Said he'd heard there were questions about your north pasture boundary and wanted to know if it might affect grazing access to the corridor. He's been after that corridor for 3 years. I know it. Hale turned from the window. He's also, I happen to know, been in correspondence with Whitmore's organization about a water agreement. I don't know what else might be in those letters. Ethan was quiet. Jim. Yeah. Is this bigger than Pruitt? Hale looked at him steadily. I think it might be. He sat down behind his desk. I think Pruitt may have filed that claim not just to make things difficult for you personally, but because someone with more to gain than Whitmore's bruised ego stands to benefit if your land title is clouded. And I think that someone may have been waiting for an opportunity, and Pruitt handed them one. The room was very still. Frank Stanton, Ethan said. I'm not saying that. You're not saying it. Hale was quiet for a moment. I'm saying be careful, and I'm saying move faster than you were planning to. Ethan was back at Sarah's within the hour. He told her everything standing in her kitchen, without sitting down, moving through it fast and clear. She listened the same way she always listened, completely, without interruption, tracking all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. We go to Helena, she said. What? We take the photograph. We take your survey documentation. We take the letter from Hattie Greer's grandson, and we go to Helena, and we put all of it in front of the County Land Commission in person before Pruitt or Stanton can file anything else. She was already moving, going to the cabinet where she kept her correspondence. My letter to Margaret's cousin, he sits on that commission. He will see us. Sarah Helena is 3 days' ride. 2.5 if we leave early. She pulled the letter out and read it quickly. He wrote back. He said he was willing to meet. She looked up. He wrote back 2 days ago, and I was going to wait until we had more. But we don't have time to wait. Ethan looked at her. You were going to tell me about this. I was going to tell you today. She held his gaze. I'm telling you now. Does it matter? He took a breath. No, it doesn't matter. He rubbed the back of his neck. We need to tell Jim Hale where we're going. Yes, and we need to tell Margaret. She'll watch the farm. She was already moving with the focused efficiency of a woman who had decided on a course of action and was executing it. We leave tomorrow morning. Sarah. He caught her arm gently as she moved past him. She stopped, looked at him. Are you sure about this? About which part? Any of it? All of it? This is a long way from where we were 2 weeks ago, and now we're riding to Helena to fight a land dispute that started because I made a choice, she said. And someone decided to make that choice expensive. Her voice was steady and her eyes were direct, and she did not look like a woman who was uncertain. I told you when we decided to do this together that I wasn't going to hide or soften or make myself easier to digest. This is what that looks like, Ethan. It's not always comfortable. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he agreed. It's not. Can you live with that? He thought about 7 years of choosing comfortable over true. He thought about the way comfortable had felt, manageable, survivable, and utterly empty. Yeah, he said, I can live with that. They left the next morning before sunup, which was early enough that the town was not yet awake to watch them go, which was by unspoken agreement the point. Margaret had been told. Hale had been told. Tommy Alcott had been told to keep an eye on both properties, which Tommy received as the most important commission of his 11 years, and took extremely seriously. The road to Helena was not easy in October. It never was. The first day was hard and cold and long, and they covered more ground than comfort suggested they should, because the particular arithmetic of 18 days minus travel time did not leave room for a gentle pace. They talked through most of it about the case, about the documentation, about the sequence in which they would present things to the commission. But they also talked about other things because two people on a long road in the cold had hours to fill, and they had between them 7 years of things that had never been said. Sarah told him about the first winter in Willow Creek, when she had run so short of money that she had eaten from her garden and nothing else for 6 weeks, and had not told a single person, because the shame of it had felt larger than the hunger. She told him this matter-of-factly without drama, the way she told him most things. He was quiet for a moment after. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me? We barely knew each other then." "I would have. I know you would have. That's partly why I didn't." She looked at the road ahead. "I had spent my whole life watching people help me because they felt sorry for me, and I didn't know yet that you were different. I didn't want more of that." "What changed?" She thought about it. "You fixed my fence post in March of that second year, and you didn't look at me like you were doing me a favor. You looked at me like it was just a thing that needed doing." She glanced at him. "That was the first time someone treated my need as ordinary, instead of as an opportunity to feel good about themselves." He absorbed this without responding immediately, which was his way. She had learned years ago that Ethan Walker's silences were not absences. They were the sound of him taking something seriously. "I want to ask you something," he said eventually. "Ask." "Agnes Porter, the women at the church hall, the way this town has treated you." He kept his eyes on the road. Does it still get to you, after 9 years?" She was quiet for a moment. "Less than it used to," she said. "But sometimes." She adjusted her coat. "The thing about that kind of thing is that it doesn't stop hurting because you get stronger. It hurts less because you get clearer. You get clearer about who you are and what your life is actually worth, and then the voices that say otherwise get quieter. Not because they stop talking, but because you stop giving them the room they need to echo." He was quiet for a while. Then, "I think that's what I've been trying to learn." "I know." She looked at him. "You're faster at it than you think." They reached Helena late on the second day. The city felt large after Willow Creek, more people, more noise, more of everything, and they took separate rooms at a boarding house near the Land Commission office, because that was the appropriate thing, and because neither of them had made any arrangement that required anything else, and the simplicity of that, the lack of pressure, was itself a kind of relief. Margaret's cousin was a man named Arthur Ellison, and he met them at the commission office the following morning with the guarded expression of a man who had agreed to a meeting but had not yet decided what he was willing to do with it. He was 60, well-dressed, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades navigating the competing interests of a land commission and had gotten very good at saying nothing that committed him to anything. He looked at Sarah with a kind of reassessment when she set the documentation on his desk. Not because she had surprised him by being there. He had known a woman was coming, but because the documentation itself was organized with a precision that clearly had not been assembled casually. "You've done this before," he said. "I've been preparing this for 9 years," she said. "Not this specifically, but being ready for this." Ellison looked at the amended mineral rights document. He looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Hattie Greer's grandson pulled it at my request." Sarah kept her voice even. "He is a clerk in this office." Ellison looked up sharply. "Young Thomas." "I believe his name is Thomas, yes." Ellison looked back at the document. The silence in the room took on a different quality. Not the silence of a man saying nothing, but the silence of a man who had just seen something he recognized and was working out what to do about the fact that he recognized it. "This amendment," he said carefully, "the handwriting doesn't match the original filing," Sarah said. "No." He set the document down. "It does not." He looked at Ethan. "How long has this claim been pending?" 14 days, Ethan said. "We have 4 days left in the review window." Ellison folded his hands. He looked between them. Then he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly. What I'm looking at here is not just a fraudulent amendment to a mineral rights document. What I'm looking at is a pattern." He paused. "There have been 2 other filings in this county in the past 18 months with similar anomalies. Neither of the other landowners caught it, because neither of the other landowners had someone assembling documentation at this level of care. Sarah did not look at Ethan, but she felt him go very still beside her. "Who filed the other claims?" Ethan asked. Ellison looked at him steadily. "I am not able to tell you that at this stage." "Can you tell me," Ethan said slowly, "whether a man named Frank Stanton was involved in either of them?" The room was very quiet. Ellison said nothing for exactly long enough that the nothing said everything. "Mr. Walker," he said finally, "I would like you and Miss Bennett to give me until tomorrow morning. I need to review some additional documentation, and I need to make a telephone call to the county attorney's office." Sarah looked at him. "You believe us?" "I believe your documentation," he said carefully, "which is considerably more than I can say for what's been filed against you." He stood. "Come back at 8 tomorrow morning." They walked out of the commission office into the cold Helena morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment without speaking. Then Ethan said, "Frank Stanton." "We don't know that yet. Ellison knows it." He looked at her. "He went quiet when I said the name." "He went quiet, which is not confirmation." She looked up at him. "But it might be. And if it is, then this was never about Whitmore's bruised feelings." Ethan's voice was level. "This was about the corridor. It's always been about the corridor. Whitmore's filing was just the opportunity." She thought about it. "Pruitt finds out Stanton wants your land. He files a claim that benefits Whitmore's organization, but also creates a cloud on your title that makes it easier for Stanton to move in after." She looked at him. "They're not working together, but they're working toward the same outcome from different directions. Using each other without knowing they're using each other. Or knowing exactly," she said. "I don't know which is worse." He exhaled. "I do. The second one is worse, because that one is deliberate." She put her hand on his arm. Not dramatically, just placed it there the way she had always touched things that mattered to her with intention, without performance. "We're not done yet. Ellison is moving. That's more than we had this morning." He covered her hand with his. "Yeah. One thing at a time." "One thing at a time," he agreed. But neither of them slept well that night. Ethan lay awake in his room running through every scenario he could construct from what they knew, mapping outcomes, calculating risks, doing the things that his mind did when it was trying to account for a threat he could not fully see. He was good at this kind of thinking. It was one of the things that had kept his ranch running through difficult years, the ability to think 3 steps ahead, even when 3 steps ahead felt too far to see. But this was different from a bad harvest, or a hard winter, or a broken fence line, because those things were impersonal. They were the world being difficult. This was a man or men looking at what Ethan had built and deciding to reach for it. And behind that was a woman who had made a choice about her own life and had been handed the bill for someone else's resentment. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about the kind of world that handed a woman that bill. He thought about Sarah writing 4 letters in the middle of the night, about the documentation she had assembled with 9 years of careful attention, about the way she had sat across from Arthur Ellison and laid out the case with a clarity and precision that had visibly adjusted the man's expectations in real time. He thought about all the ways she had been underestimated for all the years he had known her, and how every person who had underestimated her had eventually had cause to revise their assessment. He thought about the fact that the most effective thing anyone had done in this fight so far had been those 4 letters. He got up before dawn and stood at the window for a while. Then he wrote her a note and slid it under her door. It said, "I've been thinking. When this is done, if you're willing, I'd like to ask you something properly. Not in a barn. Somewhere better. Just wanted you to know that's where I am." He heard her door open 30 seconds later. She knocked on his. He opened it. She was standing in the hallway in her coat over her nightclothes holding his note. She looked at him with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but something that had surprise in it, along with other things he was still learning to read. "When this is done," she said, "I wanted to do it right. Ethan Walker. She looked at the note, then at him. We are standing in a boarding house in Helena, Montana, 4 days from losing a land dispute, having ridden 3 days to stop it, and you want to wait until it's done to say what you're clearly already saying. He opened his mouth. She held up the note. I am not waiting, she said. I crossed a barn floor. I wrote 4 letters in the middle of the night. I rode to Helena in October. My answer is yes. Whatever the question is, my answer is yes. She folded the note carefully and put it in her coat pocket. Now go to sleep. We have a meeting at 8. She went back to her room. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and felt something he had not felt in longer than he could account for. Not relief, not happiness, not even hope exactly, but something quieter and more certain than any of those. Something that felt like being exactly where he was supposed to be. They were back at Ellison's office at 8 the next morning, and Ellison was waiting for them with 2 other men neither of them recognized, and an expression that had changed overnight from careful to resolved. Sit down, he said. They sat. I made 4 telephone calls last night, he said, and I pulled 3 additional files from our records. He set his hands flat on the desk. The amendment to that mineral rights document was filed by a notary named Gerald Birch, who operated out of Billings, and who surrendered his license in 1889 under circumstances that the licensing board described as relating to document irregularities. He looked at them. Gerald Birch was at the time of that amendment under retainer to the Stanton Ranch operation. The room was completely silent. Ethan looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Ellison. Frank Stanton, she said. The documentation trail leads to the Stanton operation, Ellison said carefully. I am not in a position to... Mr. Ellison. Sarah's voice was quiet, and it did not move. We did not ride 3 days in October to hear you be careful. What does the documentation say? Ellison looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, It says that Frank Stanton has been using fraudulent mineral rights amendments to cloud land titles in this valley for at least 8 years. Mr. Walker's case is the 4th. He is the first one who caught it in time. He looked between them. The county attorney's office is opening an investigation this morning. Ethan exhaled slowly. What happens to the claim against my land? He asked. It will be dismissed, Ellison said. Within the week. Your title is clean. He paused. But Mr. Walker, I want you to understand something. When this investigation moves forward, Stanton is going to know it was you. And a man like Frank Stanton does not take that quietly. Ethan looked at the man steadily. I know it. Are you prepared for that? Mr. Ellison, Sarah said before Ethan could answer. This man has been standing his ground in that valley for 20 years, quietly alone, without asking anyone for anything. She looked at Ethan and then back at Ellison. He's not alone anymore. Her voice was simple and clear. We're prepared. They rode back to Willow Creek in 2 days instead of 2.5, because the weather held and because neither of them was inclined to move slowly when there was something to move toward. Ellison had given them a written confirmation of the dismissal, not the official order, which would take several more days to process through the county system, but a signed letter on commission letterhead stating that the Walker land claim had been reviewed and found to be supported by valid original documentation, and that the competing filing contained material irregularities under investigation by the county attorney. It was not the final word, but it was enough to carry home. Ethan kept it in his coat pocket the entire ride back. He checked for it twice without meaning to, the way a man checked for something he could not afford to lose. Sarah noticed the second time. She didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth moved. It's not going anywhere, she said. I know. It'll still be there when we get home. I know that too. He looked at the road ahead. Old habit. Checking on things. Making sure what I have is still there. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's going to be a hard habit to break. Which part? Expecting things to be taken. She glanced at him. You've been braced for loss for a long time. He thought about that. Since my father died, left me the ranch at 19, and I spent the first 2 years certain I was going to lose it. Did you ever stop being certain? I stopped showing it, he said. That's not the same thing. She nodded slowly. No, it's not. She adjusted her reins. I did the same thing with people. Stopped showing how much it hurt when they dismissed me. Got very good at performing fine. She looked at the road. Being fine and performing fine are two entirely different lives. When did you stop performing it? This morning, she said. In Ellison's office. He looked at her. I meant what I said in there, she told him. About not being alone anymore, but saying it out loud to a man who needed to hear it in a room where it mattered. That was the first time I've said something true in a room like that without dressing it up to make it easier for everyone else to receive. She met his eyes briefly. It felt different. How? Lighter, she said. Like I'd put something down. They rode in silence for a while. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had said enough for the moment and were comfortable with what the quiet held between them. They were 3 miles outside Willow Creek when they saw Tommy Alcott on the road. He was riding towards them on a horse that was moving faster than Tommy's usual pace, and his expression when he spotted them was the expression of a boy who had been given a responsibility and had been taking it so seriously that the news he was carrying had built up a considerable pressure behind his face. He pulled up beside them. You're back. We're back, Ethan said. What is it, Tommy? Mr. Stanton came to your ranch yesterday. Tommy looked between them. 2 men with him. They walked the fence line on the north pasture for about an hour. Ethan's jaw tightened. They touch anything? No, sir. Sheriff Hale showed up 20 minutes in and told them to move on. Tommy sat straighter in the saddle. Sheriff Hale said to tell you he needs to see you soon as you get back. He said don't go home first. Go straight to his office. Ethan looked at Sarah. She was already adjusting her horse's direction. Tell Margaret we're back, she said to Tommy. Tell her everything's all right. Tommy nodded with great seriousness and turned his horse. Hale was at his desk when they walked in. He looked at them the way a man looked at people he'd been worried about and was relieved to see. And then he looked at the letter in Ethan's hand, and his expression shifted into something more focused. You got something, he said. Ethan handed him the letter. Hale read it again, set it down. Ellison moved fast, he said. He had reason to. Sarah sat across from the desk. The amendment was filed by a notary who lost his license for document fraud in 1889. He was under retainer to the Stanton operation at the time he filed it. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then Frank Stanton. The county attorney's office opened an investigation yesterday morning, Ethan said. Hale leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. That explains Stanton walking your fence line. He's trying to see what he's dealing with before the investigation reaches him. What did he say when you told him to move on? Ethan asked. Said he was within his rights to observe public land access points, which is technically correct, so I couldn't do much more than stand there and make him uncomfortable. Hale looked at Ethan. He knows something is moving. He doesn't know how much yet, but he's not a stupid man. No, Ethan said. He's not. He's going to come at you before the investigation gets to him, Hale said. Not legally. He knows the legal angle is compromised. He's going to come at you the other way. Meaning, Sarah said. Meaning pressure. Meaning neighbors. Meaning the kind of community opinion that doesn't leave marks. Hale looked at her directly. Meaning you, Miss Bennett. You're the easier target, and he knows it. Sarah met his gaze without expression. I'm aware. He's going to try to make the story about a woman who turned down a respectable man and got a rancher into a legal dispute out of spite. He's going to find the Agnes Porters of this valley and water that seed until it grows into something that looks like a consensus. Agnes Porter doesn't need watering, Sarah said. She comes fully equipped. Hale almost smiled. Almost. I'm saying be ready. "I've been ready for 9 years," Sarah said. "What's different now is that I'm not doing it alone." Hale looked between them. Then he looked at Ethan. "You ready for what that means? Standing with her when Stanton comes with the full weight of his operation and his opinion behind him?" Ethan looked at the question steadily. "I've been ready for a long time, Jim. I just spent 7 years thinking I wasn't." Hale picked up the commission letter. "I'm going to have this copied, and 1 copy goes in my safe tonight." He looked at them both. "Go home. Rest. Tomorrow's going to be a different kind of day." They were right about the different kind of day. Frank Stanton moved on a Tuesday. He did not come to Ethan's ranch. He did not appear at Sarah's door. He did not make any legal filing or public declaration. What Frank Stanton did, which was the particular sophistication of a man who had spent 8 years doing exactly this, was talk to the right people, in the right rooms at the right time. By Tuesday afternoon, 4 ranchers in the valley had received informal visits from Stanton's foreman, a large, quiet man named Cord, who had the ability to convey threat without saying anything that could be reported as threatening. The conversations were friendly. They were about water access and grazing agreements and the shared interests of established ranch operations in the valley. And somewhere in the course of each conversation, Cord mentioned that there were questions about the Walker Ranch's land title that might affect shared access to the corridor, and that until those questions were resolved, it might be wise for neighboring operations to think carefully about any new arrangements with Walker. By Tuesday evening, 2 of those ranchers had quietly canceled their fall agreements with Ethan without explanation. He found out Wednesday morning, when the Alcott family sent word that they'd decided to take their hay purchase elsewhere this season. He stood in his kitchen holding the message and said nothing for a long time. Sarah arrived an hour later. She had heard from Margaret, who had heard from the Alcott's neighbor. She came in, read the look on his face before he said a word, and sat down at his table. "Cord," she said. "Cord," he confirmed. "Who else?" "Alcott's for certain. Probably the Bremner family. Their boy was supposed to come help with the north fence this week, and I haven't heard from him." He set the message down. "Stanton's cutting my income for the winter. Not all of it. Not enough that it's obvious from the outside. Just enough. Just enough that by spring you're stretched too thin to fight," she said. "Yeah," she was quiet thinking. He recognized the look, the one where she was going through every piece of information she held and sorting it for what was useful. "Who in this valley owes you something real?" she said. "Not a debt kind of owing." "I know. Who respects you enough to not be moved by Cord whispering in their ear," he thought. Bill Dawson, Doc Hadley. The Greers, all 7 of the Greer family, would walk through fire before they'd cut a neighbor loose based on Stanton's say-so. He paused. "Jim Hale, obviously, though he's not a business relationship." "That's enough," she said. "Enough for what?" She stood up. "Come with me." They spent the rest of Wednesday making visits. Not asking for anything directly, not explaining the full situation that would come later, and would come publicly, which was how Sarah intended to handle what was coming, but going to the people in Willow Creek who had long memories and clear eyes, and making sure those people understood before Cord got to them that Ethan Walker's land was clean and the dispute had been resolved by the County Land Commission. Bill Dawson's response was to shake Ethan's hand for 30 seconds and say, "Stanton's been a problem in this valley for longer than anyone said out loud. About time." His wife pressed Sarah's hands and said she'd have a word with the Alcotts. Doc Hadley said, "I treated Frank Stanton's foreman for a broken finger last spring. He got it caught in something he shouldn't have been handling." He paused meaningfully. "Seems to be a habit of the operation." Hattie Greer sat them both down and told them with the authority of a woman in her 70s, who had watched this valley from the beginning, that she had known Frank Stanton's father and his father before him. And the Stantons had been acquiring land through methods that didn't bear close examination for 3 generations. And it was long past time someone examined them closely. "You did right," Hattie told Sarah, gripping her hand. "Both of you, you did right." It was not nothing. It was in fact quietly significant. The kind of thing that did not make noise immediately, but shifted the ground underneath what was coming. But Sarah knew, and Ethan knew, that the Wednesday visits were foundation work. The real confrontation was still ahead. It arrived on Friday. Frank Stanton came to Main Street in person. This was unusual. Stanton was a man who operated through intermediaries by preference, through cord, through legal filings, through the carefully placed word in the right ear. He came in person when he wanted the appearance of openness, when he wanted to be seen doing something reasonable in public. He found Ethan at the hardware store at 10 in the morning. Stanton was a big man, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with a deliberate way of moving that communicated he owned whatever room he walked into through long habit rather than any single gesture. He nodded to the men at the counter, and then he walked to where Ethan was standing, and he said in a carrying voice that made sure the other men in the store could hear it clearly, "Walker, glad I caught you." Ethan turned. "Stanton, I wanted to offer you something." Stanton's tone was the tone of a reasonable man, making a reasonable offer to another reasonable man. "All this land business, the filing, the dispute, it's gotten complicated for everybody. That's not what anyone wanted." "Isn't it?" Ethan said. "I'd like to propose a clean solution. You've got 140 acres that's more trouble than it's been worth lately. I'll give you fair market value better than fair. You take it, you simplify your situation, and we put all of this behind us." He spread his hands. "Everybody comes out ahead." The hardware store was very quiet. 4 men at the counter who had been pretending not to listen had stopped pretending. Ethan looked at Stanton for a long moment. "How long have you been running that notary's amendment scheme?" he said. Stanton's expression did not change. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Gerald Birch," Ethan said, "lost his notary license in 1889 for document fraud, was under retainer to your operation at the time he filed an amendment to a 40-year-old mineral rights document that had no business being amended." He kept his voice even. "The county attorney's office knows his name. They know your retainer records. And there are 2 other filings in this county with the same irregularities that are now also under review." Dead silence. One of the men at the counter had turned around fully and was no longer making any effort to appear uninvolved. Stanton's face had gone very still. The reasonable expression was still technically in place, but the warmth had gone out of it entirely. "You're making a serious accusation," he said quietly. "I'm stating facts that are currently in the possession of the county attorney's office and the land commission in Helena." Ethan's voice did not rise. "The accusation is theirs to make. I'm just telling you what I know. I came here in good faith. You came here to buy land you tried to take legally and couldn't." Ethan looked at him steadily. "My land is not for sale. Not at fair market value, not at better than fair, not at any price you have." He held the man's gaze without blinking. "We're done." Stanton looked at him for a long moment. The silence in the hardware store had the particular quality of held breath. Then Stanton said very quietly, so that only Ethan could hear, "You don't know what you've started." "I didn't start anything," Ethan said, equally quiet. "You did, 8 years ago with the first filing." He picked up the fencing staples he'd come for. "Have a good morning, Mr. Stanton." He put his money on the counter, nodded to the men standing there, and walked out. He was halfway down the street when he heard the hardware store door open behind him. He did not turn around. He kept walking. Bill Dawson caught up to him at the corner. "Every man in that store heard every word of it," Bill said, slightly out of breath, "including the part about the county attorney." "Good," Ethan said. Stanton looked like he'd swallowed something sideways. "Also good." Bill grabbed his arm and stopped him. "Ethan, that took something. What you just did in there." He looked at him with the directness of a man who had known him for 20 years. "You know that, right?" Ethan looked at him. "I've got things worth standing for now," he said. "Makes it easier." Bill looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded slowly with the expression of a man confirming something he'd been hoping to see for a long time. Sarah was at the church hall on Friday afternoon for the weekly women's meeting, which she attended with the same consistency she had always brought to it, because absence would have been retreat, and retreat was a thing she had decided she was done with. She was there when Agnes Porter arrived. took her usual chair, and opened with the particular brightness of a woman who had received interesting information and had been waiting to deploy it. "I heard Frank Stanton made an offer on the Walker property," Agnes said. "Very generous by all accounts." The room waited. Sarah kept her hands in her lap. "Mr. Stanton made an offer," she said. "Ethan declined." Agnes tilted her head. "That seems unwise given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be, Agnes?" "The legal uncertainty, the dispute." Agnes smoothed her skirt. "I would think a man in Ethan Walker's position would be glad of a clean resolution." "His position," Sarah said, "is that his land is clear. The dispute has been dismissed by the County Land Commission, and the filing against him is under investigation as part of a larger pattern of document fraud in this valley." She looked at Agnes with complete steadiness. "That is his position. It's quite a good one." The silence in the room was different from Agnes's usual silences. This one had more air in it. "Document fraud," said Dottie Hale from across the room. "The amendment used to file the competing claim was made by a notary who lost his license for document irregularities," Sarah said. "He was under retainer to another operation in the valley at the time he filed it. The county attorney is now looking at that operation's records." "Which operation?" someone asked. Sarah let the question sit for a moment. "I'm not going to say anything more than what's already in front of the county attorney," she said. "But I'll say this. There are 4 families in this valley who may have lost land access rights in the past 8 years because of the same scheme used against Ethan's property. If any of those families have documentation of disputes that seem to resolve against them without clear reason, the county attorney's office would very much like to hear from them." Another silence. Different again. Agnes Porter said nothing. For the first time in as long as anyone in that room could remember, Agnes Porter had absolutely nothing to say. Dottie Hale looked at Sarah with an expression that was not subtle. She was smiling. Sarah did not smile back. Not because she wasn't pleased, but because this was not the moment for pleased. This was the moment for clear. For the kind of clear that people carried home with them and repeated at their supper tables because it had the ring of something true. After the meeting, Dottie walked out with her. 4 families, Dottie said. "Do you know which 4? "I have a reasonable suspicion about 3 of them," Sarah said. "The commission has the records. It's their job to reach out. But I thought if someone in that room happened to mention it at supper tonight, the information might reach the right people faster than a formal letter." Dottie looked at her with open admiration. "Sarah Bennett." "Dottie? You have been sitting in that church hall for 9 years letting Agnes Porter talk at you." "I have." "And all this time you were paying attention," Sarah said, "and waiting until it mattered." Dottie laughed a real full laugh. "Lord, Agnes doesn't know what hit her." "Agnes is not the important part," Sarah said. "The families are." Dottie nodded, sobered. "Yes, you're right." She patted Sarah's arm. "I'll make sure the right people hear it." The week that followed was the kind of week that did not announce itself as significant while it was happening. It was made up of small things, conversations, letters, the gradual shift of community opinion that happened not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of individual people revising their understanding of a situation. Bill Dawson's wife spoke to the Alcotts. The Alcotts reinstated their hay agreement. Hattie Greer's family told 3 neighboring families about the commission letter. 2 of those families began pulling out their own land records. The county attorney's office sent a formal request to the Stanton operation for records related to 3 specific filings. Cord was seen leaving the Stanton ranch on horseback headed toward Billings on a Thursday morning, which in Willow Creek was noted and discussed. Frank Stanton made no further public appearances. Ethan spent the week doing what he always did when things were in motion that he could not fully control. He worked. He repaired fence line. He moved cattle to the winter pasture. He did the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running through November, and he let the doing of them settle him the way physical work had always settled him. Sarah came every afternoon, sometimes to help with the work, sometimes to sit on the porch with coffee while he finished it. The distinction between her farm and his ranch had become in practice more a matter of geography than of separate lives, and neither of them had made a formal announcement about this or discussed it in terms that required a definition. It simply was what it was, the way true things often simply were. On Thursday evening, she arrived and found him on the porch with a piece of paper in his hands that she didn't recognize. "What is it?" she said. He handed it to her without speaking. It was from the county attorney's office. A preliminary finding. 2 names on a list of landowners affected by fraudulent filings associated with the Stanton operation. The first name was a family called Brennan, who had lost grazing access to 40 acres in 1895 and had never understood exactly why. The second name was Robert Bennett. Sarah went very still. "Bennett," she said. "Robert Bennett," Ethan said quietly. "That's your father's brother. He had land here before you arrived." She knew that. She knew it in the way she knew things. She had put carefully away. Her Uncle Robert had sold his land in 1896, after a dispute she had never fully understood, and had moved his family to Oregon. She had been 12 years old. She had not known the details, because no one had explained them to a 12-year-old girl, and then years had passed, and she had come to Willow Creek for reasons that felt like her own, and had not connected them to anything that came before. He didn't sell, she said. According to this, he was pressured out. The same notary, the same amendment scheme filed against his grazing rights in 1895. Ethan's voice was very gentle. "Sarah, you didn't come here by accident." She looked at the paper, then away, then back. "I thought I chose this place," she said. "You did choose it." He leaned forward. "That's not what I said. I said you didn't come here by accident. I think you came here because some part of you knew this place had something unfinished in it, something that belonged to your family." He paused. "And I think the fact that you spent 9 years paying attention to every detail of this valley-building relationships, learning everything there was to know, I think that wasn't an accident either." She was holding the paper and not quite looking at it. "He lost his land," she said quietly. "And you got it back," Ethan said. "Not the same acres, but—" He stopped. "You stood up in front of the County Land Commission, and you put together the case that unraveled the scheme that took it from him. 30 years later, a Bennett helped bring it down." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing, Sarah." She looked at him for a long time. There were things moving across her face that he did not try to name. He had learned over weeks of new closeness that Sarah's grief was not something she needed him to manage. She needed him to be still while she moved through it, which was different from being absent and different from being helpful. It was simply being present, and it was the one thing he had always been good at without knowing it was a skill. She set the paper down on her knee. "I need to write to my uncle," she said. "I know. He should know what happened, what's being found." She looked at her hands. "He's been living 30 years not knowing why he lost it." "Yes." She looked up. "Ethan?" "Yeah. I'm not sad," she said. "I want you to understand that. What I'm feeling right now is not sad. It's—" She stopped looking for the word. "It's the feeling of something fitting together. Like I've been looking at a map with a piece missing and someone just found the piece." She held his gaze. "I'm not sad. I'm angry, and I'm also—I don't have the word for it." "Home," he said quietly. "You're home." She looked at him. He lifted one shoulder slightly. "You've been home for 9 years, and you just found out the home chose you back." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across and took his hand. Not the way she'd taken it in the barn, weighted with the meaning of a thing being said for the first time. The way she took it now was different. Easy. Certain. The way you held something that was already yours. "I still have to write that letter," she said. "Write it tonight," he said. "I'll sit with you." She nodded. "And Ethan," she said. "That thing you wrote me. In Helena. At the boarding house." He went very still. "The note. You said when this is done." "I remember." "I want to know," she said carefully, "what you were going to ask." He looked at her. The evening had gone dark around them, the way evenings went dark in late October, fast and final. He could hear the cattle settling in the near pasture. He could hear the wind in the cottonwoods along her fence line from here. "I was going to ask you to marry me," he said. "Somewhere better than a barn or a boarding house hallway." "You said I already answered. You said your answer was yes to whatever the question was." His hand tightened slightly over hers. "I want to ask it properly. Not when we were in the middle of everything, when things were calmer." "And are they calmer?" He thought about it. "Calmer than they were." "Then ask," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark of the October evening. This woman who had crossed a barn floor and written 4 letters in the night and ridden 3 days to Helena, and sat across from a land commissioner and taken apart a fraud scheme that had taken her own family's land 30 years before she arrived to dismantle it. This woman who had spent 9 years being underestimated and had used every one of those years to learn something. "Sarah Bennett," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not a question quite. It was the way a man said something he already knew the answer to, but needed to say aloud, because saying it aloud made it real. "Yes," she said. "I told you in a hallway in Helena, and I'm telling you again on your porch in October." She squeezed his hand. "The answer does not change based on the location." He exhaled. She laughed softly. "You were holding your breath." "I was not." "Ethan Walker, you were absolutely holding your breath." "I've been holding my breath for 7 years," he said. "Old habit." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Simple, easy. The way 2 people moved when the distance between them had finally closed for good. "Write the letter first," he said. "Then we'll tell Margaret. She's going to be insufferable about it. She's going to say she knew all along. She did know all along." "I know," Sarah said. "That's what's going to make her insufferable." He smiled, the real one. And they sat on the porch in the October dark, and inside the house, a letter waited to be written to a man in Oregon who deserved to know what had been found. And outside in the valley, a land commission investigation was moving toward a conclusion that was going to change things in ways neither of them could entirely predict yet. But right now in this moment, none of that was the most important thing. The most important thing was a man and a woman on a porch with their hands interlocked who had found their way to each other through 7 years of circling and 4 days in Helena, and 1 note slipped under a door in the middle of the night. And that was in the end exactly enough. The letter to Robert Bennett went out on a Friday, written in Sarah's careful hand at Ethan's kitchen table while he sat across from her with coffee and did not hurry her. She wrote 3 drafts. The first one was too careful, the language of a woman who had spent years softening difficult things for the comfort of the person receiving them. She crumpled it. The second one was too angry. She could feel the 30 years of her uncle's displacement coming through the pen, and it was real, and it was valid. But it was not what he needed to receive in Oregon on an ordinary morning without warning. She crumpled that one too. The third one was true. It told him what had been found, what the county attorney's office was investigating, what the commission letter said. It told him that the land he had lost had not been lost fairly, and that the mechanism used to take it was now under examination, and that he deserved to know this regardless of what came next. It did not promise him restitution. It did not promise him anything. It simply told him the truth, which was the thing he had been owed for 30 years and had never received. She sealed it and set it down and looked at it for a moment. "You think he'll write back?" Ethan said. "I don't know." She picked up her coffee. "He may not want to revisit it. Some people, when something hurts badly enough and long enough, they build a wall around it. Going back means taking the wall down." "Do you think he built a wall around it?" She thought about her uncle, a quiet man she remembered from childhood, careful with his words, careful with his feelings, the kind of man who showed love through doing rather than saying. Rather like Ethan, she thought, though she did not say so. "Yes," she said. "I think he built a very solid one." She looked at the letter. "But I think he deserves the chance to decide whether to open the door. She mailed it Saturday morning on her way to the church hall where she had been invited by Dottie Hale deliberately and with a certain amount of tactical purpose to speak to the women's group about the Land Commission findings and what families in the valley ought to know. Agnes Porter was not present. This was noted by everyone and mentioned by no one. Sarah stood at the front of the church hall and told them plainly what had happened, what the scheme had been, how it worked, what documentation to look for if they thought their families might have been affected, and where to direct inquiries to the county attorney's office. She did not make it about herself. She did not make it about Ethan. She made it about information because information was what these women needed, and information was what she had, and sharing it was simply the right thing to do. When she finished, an older woman in the second row, named Clara Tate, raised her hand and said, "My husband lost grazing rights to a back parcel in 1897. We never understood why the county ruled against him. He died thinking he'd missed something in the paperwork." The room was very quiet. "Bring his records to the county attorney's office," Sarah said. "Tell them Clara Tate is coming and tell them why. They're looking for exactly that." Clara Tate nodded. Her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words and it carried 26 years. Dottie walked out with Sarah afterward and said, "That was the most useful meeting this church hall has hosted in the entire time I've been attending it." "That's a low bar," Sarah said. "It is," Dottie agreed cheerfully. "But you cleared it by a considerable margin." The county attorney's investigation moved faster than anyone had expected, which was partly due to the quality of the documentation that Sarah and Ethan had brought from Helena, and partly due to the fact that 3 additional families had come forward in the 2 weeks following the church hall meeting with records that matched the pattern precisely. Clara Tate's husband's 1897 case. A family called Dunmore, who had lost mineral access rights in 1899, and had moved their operation to the eastern part of the county. Rather than fight a legal battle, they didn't have the money to sustain. And a widow named Frances Alcott. Tommy's grandmother, though Tommy did not know this until his mother told him quietly one evening, who had been pressured off 40 acres in 1901 and had accepted a buyout that was in retrospect a fraction of what the land was worth. 6 families, spanning 12 years, all connected to the same notary, the same amendment scheme, the same operation. When the county attorney's office named Frank Stanton formally in the investigation, it did not happen quietly. It happened on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday noon, every person in Willow Creek knew, because the county attorney sent 2 men to the Stanton Ranch to serve formal notice, and they went down Main Street to get there, and Main Street was not a private road. Ethan heard about it from Bill Dawson, who appeared at the ranch with the expression of a man delivering news he had been anticipating for some time, and was experiencing a complicated mixture of satisfaction and sobriety about. "They served him this morning," Bill said. "Cord was seen leaving with 2 trunks and a horse this afternoon, heading east." "Cord's running," Ethan said. "Looks like." Bill leaned against the fence post. "Stanton's still at the ranch. His attorney from Billings arrived this morning." He paused. "Word is Stanton's already talking about a settlement. He knows the records are too clean to fight." Ethan absorbed this without expression. "How do the families feel?" he said. Bill looked at him. "Which families?" "The ones who came forward, the Tates, the Dunmores, Frances Alcott." He looked at the north pasture. "They've been carrying this for a long time. A settlement isn't the same as being made right." Bill was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it's not." "What does the county attorney say about restitution?" "That's going to take longer than the investigation. The legal mechanism for it's complicated." "Yeah." Ethan looked at the fence line. "It always is." He was quiet for a beat. Those families lost more than land. They lost years of income. They lost the ability to plan. Frances Alcott raised Tommy's father on 40 acres she should have had and didn't. He looked at Bill. "Money doesn't fix that." "No," Bill said. "It doesn't. But it helps," Ethan said. "And it matters that someone made them say it out loud, that what was done to them has a name now and a record." Bill nodded slowly. "Sarah's meeting," he said. "At the church hall. That's what made those women come forward." "I know." "Clara Tate told my wife she had those records in a box for 26 years because nobody had ever told her they were worth something." Bill looked at him. "Sarah told her they were worth something." Ethan said nothing. He was looking at the north pasture at the fence line that ran along the boundary his grandfather had established and his father had taught him to maintain, and that 3 men had tried in 3 different ways to take from him in the past 2 months. The fence line was intact. It had always been intact. What had changed was that now everyone knew it. "She changed things," Bill said quietly. "And she did it without making it about herself." "That's her way," Ethan said. Sarah was in her garden when Ethan came to tell her about Stanton and Cord and the county attorney. She was doing the last of the winter preparation, cutting back the herb beds, mulching the root vegetables, covering the cold frames against the coming frost. The kind of work she did at this time every year, methodical, and practiced the work of a woman who had learned to think in seasons and plan further ahead than the present required. He told her standing at the garden fence, and she listened with her hands still and her eyes on him. When he finished, she said, "Clara Tate." "What about her?" "Did anyone tell her?" "I don't know." She pulled off her gardening gloves. "Someone should tell her today. Not from the county attorney. Not in a letter. Someone should go to her house and tell her in person that the man who took her husband's land has been formally charged." She looked at him. "It should be a person, not a document." He looked at her. "You want to go?" he said. "I want us to go," she said. "Together. Today." Clara Tate lived in a small house at the south end of town that she had occupied since her husband's death, and that she kept with the fierce tidiness of a woman who had decided long ago that her circumstances were not going to determine her standards. She opened the door when they knocked and looked at them both with the expression of a woman who had been waiting without knowing she was waiting. Sarah said, "We came to tell you in person. Frank Stanton was formally charged this morning. The records are being reviewed. Your husband's case is part of the official record." Clara Tate stood in her doorway for a moment. Then she said, "Come in." She made them coffee. She sat across from them at her kitchen table, and she held her cup in both hands, the way people held things when they needed something to hold. And she told them about her husband, about Henry Tate, who had spent the last years of his life believing he had made a mistake in that 1897 filing, that he had missed something, that the loss was somehow his fault. She told them about watching him carry that without being able to take it from him. She told them about the particular cruelty of a man going to his grave, holding blame for something that was not his fault. "He was so careful," she said. "He was the most careful man with paperwork you ever met. He went over everything twice. He told me until the day he died that he must have missed something." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite. "He didn't miss anything." "No," Sarah said. "He didn't." "Someone took it from him." "Yes." Clara looked at her coffee. "Does that change anything?" "For him. He's been gone 11 years. It changes the record," Sarah said carefully, "and I know that's not the same, but it means that someday, if Henry Tate's grandchildren want to know what happened to his land, they will find an official record that says their grandfather was right, that he was careful and thorough, and that what happened to him was done to him, not by him." She paused. "That matters. It may not feel like enough right now, but it matters." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you for coming here yourself." "We wanted to," Ethan said. She looked between them. "You're getting married," she said. It was not a question. Sarah looked at her. "How did you—" "It's the way you two sit," Clara said simply. "Henry and I sat like that for 40 years. She almost smiled. "You don't think about how you're positioned. You just orient toward each other." Sarah's hand, which had been resting on the table, found Ethan's. "We are," she said. "Getting married." Clara nodded. "Good," she said quietly. "You both deserve something good." They told Margaret on the way home. Margaret had been told nothing, which had required a restraint that she made clear had cost her considerably, and she greeted the news with the comprehensive emotional response of a woman who had been right about something for years, and had been patient about being right, and was now fully entitled to her vindication. She cried. She was clear-eyed about the fact that she was crying. She hugged Sarah first, and then Ethan, which surprised him. Margaret was not a physically demonstrative woman, and then she held him by both arms and looked at him directly and said, "I have been waiting for you to get out of your own way for 6 years, Ethan Walker. I hope you know that." "I've been told," he said. "By whom?" "Mostly by myself lately." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose assessment had been confirmed. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." The wedding was in December, which was earlier than anyone expected, and later than Margaret had been quietly campaigning for since approximately 48 hours after Sarah's answer in the boarding house hallway. It was not a large wedding. It was a practical one. The church, the people who mattered, a meal at the Dawsons' house afterward because Bill Dawson's wife had offered, and the offer had come from a genuine place, and it seemed right to accept genuine things when they were offered. Agnes Porter sent a note that said she wished them well. The note had the handwriting of a woman who had chosen her words with great care and the brevity of a woman who did not have much to say that she trusted herself to say correctly. Sarah read it, set it down, and said, "That took something." Ethan read it. "You're being generous. She's an unhappy person," Sarah said. "I don't need her approval, but I'm not going to be the reason she's more unhappy than she already is." She set the note aside. That's enough. It was enough. Sarah had learned over 9 years and the events of the past 2 months to distinguish between the things that required her energy and the things that did not, and Agnes Porter's complicated feelings about her life choices fell definitively into the second category. Robert Bennett wrote back 3 weeks after Sarah's letter. He wrote from Oregon, from a house she had never seen in handwriting she barely recognized from a man she had last seen when she was 12 years old. The letter was 2 pages. The first page was the letter of a man who did not know what to do with what he had been told. The processing the questions, the careful circling of something painful. The second page was different. The second page was the letter of a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for 30 years and was for the first time standing upright without it. He wrote, "I always told myself I had missed something, that I wasn't careful enough or smart enough or present enough to hold on to what my father built. I told my children we moved to Oregon because of opportunity. I told myself the same thing for long enough that I almost believed it. To learn that it was taken, that there was a mechanism and a name and a record, I don't know what to call what I'm feeling. It isn't simple. But it isn't what I've been carrying either. You said I deserved to know the truth regardless of what came next. You were right. I did." He also wrote, "Your grandmother always said you had her instincts. I can see now that she was right." Sarah read that line 3 times. She showed it to Ethan. He read it, looked at her. What were her instincts? "She always said she had an instinct for things that were unfinished," Sarah said. "She'd walk into a room and know immediately what needed doing, not just the practical things, She paused. The things that had been left wrong for too long. She had an eye for it, and she left it to you." Sarah looked at the letter. "Apparently." He watched her fold it carefully and put it in the small box on the shelf where she kept things she wanted to keep. Not many things, but the things that mattered. The survey documentation was already there. Ellison's commission letter. The photograph of the cairn. "Uncle Robert is coming in the spring," she said. "He wants to see the valley." "Does he want to see the land?" "I think he wants to walk it," she said. "Not to reclaim it, just to see it again. Know it's still there." She looked at Ethan. "Would that be all right?" "The land is clean," Ethan said. "He's welcome on it any time he wants." She looked at him for a moment. "You know, when I said we were doing this together, I didn't fully know yet what that meant. I don't think either of us did. And now I think it means that nothing that matters to me is separate from you anymore." She held his gaze. And nothing that matters to you is separate from me. And that's not—" She thought about how to say it. "That's not what I was afraid of. I thought closeness like this would feel like losing something, like giving up room." "Does it? It feels like gaining room," she said. "It feels like the whole shape of things got bigger." She looked at her hands. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," he said. Frank Stanton settled with the county in February. The settlement required him to compensate 6 families to surrender the fraudulent mineral rights claims and to submit to a formal audit of his land operation going back 15 years. He did not go to prison. The law in 1892 was not what it ought to have been, and a man with Stanton's resources and attorneys had options that ordinary people did not. But he was finished in Willow Creek. He sold the ranch by April and left the valley without ceremony, and the valley did not mourn his going. The grazing corridor through Ethan's north pasture, which had been the real object of everything that had happened, was formally protected through a county access agreement that named Walker as the primary rights holder, and that could not be amended without his written consent. Jim Hale told Ethan about it over coffee at the hardware store in March and said, "Your grandfather would have appreciated the irony of a land commission protecting what he filed." "My grandfather," Ethan said, "would have said it should have been done in 1873 and saved everyone a great deal of trouble." "Your grandfather would have been right," Hale said. Clara Tate received a formal apology from the county, not restitution, not yet, but acknowledgement, which was its own kind of thing. And she received it in writing, in a letter that used her husband's name, and spelled it correctly, and said plainly that Henry Tate had done nothing wrong. She framed it. She told Dottie Hale that she knew it was only paper, but that some things were worth keeping on paper because paper stayed when people couldn't. Tommy Alcott, who had been 11 years old when he carried news across a field with great seriousness, and had since been told by his mother about his grandmother Frances and her 40 acres, developed in the following years a deep and sustained interest in land law that eventually took him to a college in Helena. He became an attorney. He handled land cases. He was known in his practice for a particular attention to documentation irregularities. When people asked him why he'd gone into that specific kind of law, he told them about a man and a woman who had ridden to Helena with a photograph and a commission letter and had changed things. The ranch changed over the years following the wedding. Not all at once, and not in any single dramatic way. The way real things changed, which was slowly and accumulating. Sarah expanded the garden into 2 more beds. The medicines she made became well enough known that she began receiving written requests from as far as Billings, which she fulfilled on a sliding scale, that she did not explain to anyone, but which operated on the principle that people who could pay did, and people who couldn't didn't, and the 2 facts balanced each other without requiring a policy. The old barn got its roof properly replaced in the 2nd year, which cost more than Ethan had planned for, and less than he had feared. And Sarah cooked for the 3 men who came to do the work, and they told Ethan afterward it was the best week of eating they'd had in a year. Margaret Collins came to supper every Thursday. This was never formally arranged. It was simply the case that Margaret arrived every Thursday at 6 o'clock, and Ethan set a 3rd place at the table, and nobody mentioned it as a plan, because it had moved past being a plan into being simply the shape of things. She was there on the evening 20 years later, when Ethan came in from the north pasture with the particular quiet that Sarah had learned over 20 years of reading him meant something significant had happened. She did not ask while Margaret was there. She waited. After supper, after Margaret had gone home with her coat and her independent stride, after the dishes were washed and the kitchen was quiet, she looked at him across the table and said, "What happened today?" It was not a question. He was quiet for a moment. "I rode the north fence line this afternoon." "You ride it every autumn." "I know." He looked at his hands on the table. "I stopped at the cairn." She waited. "I've been stopping at that cairn every spring and every autumn for as long as I can remember," he said. "I checked that the stones are in place, that the configuration matches the survey. I've done it since I was 19 years old, and my father left me this land." He looked up. "I realized today that I didn't check it. I just stood there. I looked at it, and I thought about my grandfather building it in 1873, and my father teaching me to maintain it, and then the two of us riding out to photograph it before dawn, and all of everything that followed from that morning. He paused. And I didn't feel the need to check. I knew it was right. I just knew. Sarah looked at him. You stopped bracing, she said. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. I think I finally stopped bracing. She stood up and poured them both coffee and sat back down with the ease of a woman who knew exactly which chair she belonged in, at which table, and had known for 20 years and never tired of the knowing. I got a letter from Tommy today, she said. The land case in Helena. He won it. She set her coffee down. 4 families. Same pattern as ours, different county. He said the commission cited our case as precedent. She looked at him. He says the phrase in the ruling is the Bennett-Walker documentation standard. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Bennett-Walker, he said. His name for it, not ours to choose. She almost smiled. He said it when he wrote to us after the ruling. He said he wanted us to know that what we did in that office in 1892 was still working. Ethan looked at the table, at his coffee, at the woman across from him who had crossed a barn floor 20 years ago because she was done letting a man she loved talk himself out of something real. We didn't plan it, he said. The documentation. We didn't set out to set any standard. We were just trying to keep the land. I know. She looked at him. That's usually how it works. The things that last are the things people did because they were the right things to do, not because they were trying to build something lasting. He picked up his coffee, held it. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Stanton hadn't gone after the land? If Pruitt hadn't filed that claim? Sometimes. And she thought about it honestly. I think we'd have gotten here eventually, she said. I think I would have crossed that barn floor one way or another. I was already almost there. She looked at him. But I think it would have been slower, and I think some of what we found out about Uncle Robert, about the families, would have stayed buried. She paused. Sometimes the thing that's trying to hurt you forces something into the open that needed to be open. He nodded slowly. The wall coming down, he said. Both ways, she said. The wall Stanton built around other people's losses, and the wall you built around yourself. She held his gaze. Both came down. He was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet she had long since stopped misreading as absence. It was the sound of him being present. I've been counting things wrong for most of my life, he said. I used to count what I didn't have, the acres I couldn't buy, the money I couldn't save, the things I thought made me less than other men. He looked at his hands. I count differently now. What do you count? She said. He looked up at her. You, he said. First and always, then everything we built together. Then the people who stayed when it was hard. Clara Tate, who came forward. Tommy, who rode across the field. Margaret, who told the truth to both of us when we were too careful to tell it to ourselves. He paused. I count the fact that your uncle walked this land in the spring, and he cried at the cairn when I showed him what it marked. And he didn't apologize for crying, and I didn't look away. He held her gaze. I count the letter he sent after that visit, where he said he finally understood why his niece came to this valley. He said she came to finish what he couldn't. Sarah's hands were very still on the table. He wrote that to you? She said. He wrote it to both of us. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He said to tell you that whatever your grandmother's instincts were, you got them in full, and then some. She looked down at their hands, his over hers. The same gesture that had begun in a barn on a cold October morning 20 years ago, and had not in 20 years lost any of its weight. I used to be afraid, she said quietly, that the life I was building here was only mine, that it would only ever be mine, that I would do everything right and work as hard as I could, and it still wouldn't. She stopped. That I would still be on the outside of something, that I would never be fully in. Are you, he said, fully in? She looked at him. The man who had tipped his hat and driven nails and stacked firewood and ridden to Helena in October and put a note under a door in the middle of the night and asked a question he already knew the answer to on a dark porch in November and had not in 20 years given her a single reason to doubt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I have been," she said, "since the morning I crossed that barn floor and you reached back." Outside, the north pasture held its ground. The cairn stood at the fence line where it had always stood. The land was clean and the record was true, and the people who had tried to take it were gone. And in a kitchen in Willow Creek, Montana, a man and a woman sat across from each other the way they had sat for 20 years with coffee and truth, and the particular ease of two people who had stopped performing and started living, and who understood in the way that only people who had earned understanding could understand that the greatest thing a person could do was not to find someone who made them feel worthy. It was to find someone who had always been worthy, and to cross whatever distance was necessary to reach them. Sarah Bennett had crossed a barn floor, and everything that was real had begun exactly there.